Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the ocean. Not the ocean as you see it from a beach, with its familiar horizon and the smell of sunscreen and salt, but the ocean as the ancient sailors knew it, vast and dark, stretching in every direction without end, without a single landmark to anchor the eye, the kind of ocean that swallowed ships whole and returned nothing but silence and the slow turning of stars overhead. This was the ocean that the early navigators sailed into, with maps that ended at the edge of the known world and nothing beyond them but drawings of sea monsters and the fearful notation that sailors placed at the margins of their charts. Here there be dragons. And now, somewhere in that immensity, imagine a small island rising from the water. It is not large enough to matter by most measures of geography. It might be a few miles across, perhaps less. It might hold a handful of fishing villages clustered at the edge of a natural harbour, a jungle of dense and dripping green, a coral reef that glows in shades of turquoise and pale gold when the sun sits low on the water. To the eye of a practical person, it is an unremarkable place, a small interruption in an otherwise featureless expanse of ocean, the kind of thing you might glance at and sail past without a second thought. And yet, for that island, for islands exactly like it, scattered across every ocean on Earth from the frozen channels above Scandinavia to the warm equatorial waters of the East Indies, empires rose. Not rose metaphorically or figuratively, but rose in the most literal sense. Fleets were assembled in home ports thousands of miles away, provisioned with months of biscuit and salted meat and barrels of fresh water, crewed by men who had never seen the place they were sailing toward, and who, in many cases, would never return from it. Wars were fought that lasted years, sometimes decades. Treaties were signed in gilded European halls by ministers and ambassadors who traded these islands like pieces in an endless game, and sometimes those trades changed the course of world history in ways that nobody at the signing table could have predicted. A small island was swapped for a much larger territory, and the island turned out to be worth more in the long run than anyone had guessed. A battle fought on a coral reef in the Pacific decided which country would dominate an entire ocean for the next century. A volcanic island barely large enough to walk across in an afternoon was the reason the Dutch East India Company became the most powerful commercial organisation in the history of the world. Tonight, we're going to travel through that history together. This is a sleep story, which means it is designed to carry you gently through a long and interesting journey, without demanding that you follow every argument with full alertness. Let the images wash over you. Let the history settle into your mind the way that stories do when you're drifting at the edge of sleep, not as a list of facts to be memorized, but as a landscape to be visited, a world of particular sights and smells and sounds that becomes, somehow, more real in the liminal hours between wakefulness and dreaming than it ever does in the clear light of day. The best history told well has always been like this, not a catalogue of dates and battles, but a story of human beings making decisions in specific places at specific times, under conditions that we can, with a little imagination, begin to feel our way into. We are going to visit the islands that the world's greatest empires could not stop fighting over, and we are going to understand why. We will sail with Portuguese navigators into the Banda Sea in the golden age of spice, when a single boatload of nutmeg could make a merchant wealthy for life, and when the knowledge of where these islands lay was itself one of the most closely guarded secrets in the world. We will walk the narrow streets of Valletta as the cannonballs of the Ottoman Empire fall around us, and an old Frenchman in armour leads the defence of a limestone fortress against the greatest military machine of the 16th century. We will follow the cinnamon trails of Ceylon through 3 empires and 4 centuries. We will drift through the clove groves of Zanzibar on a warm evening, watching the dhow sails fill with the monsoon wind. We will stand on the black volcanic sand of a Pacific island and watch, from a safe distance of history, the terrible mathematics of the 20th century's most brutal war play out across a few square kilometres of contested ground. This is a sleep story, which means we will move through these histories slowly and with care, pausing in each place long enough to feel the texture of the stone and the heat of the sun, and the weight of centuries pressing down on the present moment. History, when told this way, has a particular quality that sits somewhere between a dream and a memory, the kind of story that you carry with you even as your mind begins to drift away from conscious attention, that plants its images quietly in the fertile ground of the almost asleep mind and lets them grow in the dark hours that follow. So find a comfortable position. Let your body settle into whatever surface it rests on, and feel the weight of your limbs becoming heavy, becoming comfortable, becoming less urgent than they were a few minutes ago. We are going to travel a very long way tonight, and by the time we return, you will understand something that most people who have ever looked at a map of the world have never quite grasped. That the smallest places on Earth have always held the largest secrets, and that the ocean, which appears to separate them from the rest of the world, has always been the thing that connected them to everything. The question itself seems almost absurd when you first encounter it stated plainly. Why would an empire, a vast political machine controlling millions of people, commanding armies of tens of thousands, presiding over entire continents of territory, why would such an entity care about a tiny island? Why would it spend the lives of soldiers and sailors, the treasure of its taxpayers, the diplomatic energy of its most skilled ministers, all to acquire and hold a piece of land that you could walk across in an afternoon without breaking a sweat? The answer, it turns out, is never really about the island itself. It is always about what the island controls, which trade route, which harbour, which monopoly on a natural product, which choke point in the flow of maritime commerce. And to understand that, we have to go back to the very beginning of the age when islands first became strategic prizes, back to a time when the most valuable substances on Earth were not gold or silver or oil or uranium, but the dried seeds and bark and flowers of tropical trees that grew only in a few specific places on a handful of tiny islands in a sea that most Europeans had never heard of, and that most European maps represented, if they represented it at all, as an undifferentiated blank. The age of island empires began not with politics or military strategy, but with appetite, specifically with the European appetite for the flavours and fragrances that we now call spices, and with the extraordinary geography that had concentrated the production of those flavours and fragrances on a handful of volcanic islands on the other side of the world. Everything that followed, the galleons and the cannons, the slave ships and the sugar mills, the sieges and the treaties and the massacres, everything flows from that initial fact, that the things Europeans most wanted grew only in specific places, and those places were islands. The nutmeg tree is not, on first inspection, a particularly impressive plant. It is a medium-sized evergreen that grows to perhaps 20 metres in height under favourable conditions, with waxy dark green leaves that catch the light in the way of many tropical trees, and small yellow flowers that bloom in fragrant clusters and attract the particular attention of birds and insects that will carry their pollen to the next tree. The fruit it produces looks, when ripe, something like a pale apricot, smooth-skinned, slightly dusty in colour, unremarkable to the eye until it splits open, and when it does split, when the outer skin peels back to reveal what lies inside, it offers one of the more extraordinary natural spectacles in the plant kingdom. A dark, lustrous seed, the nutmeg, wrapped in a vivid red membrane called the aerial that branches across the seed's surface, in a pattern that looks uncannily like a web of blood vessels, organic and strange and deeply beautiful in a way that is difficult to explain and impossible to forget once you have seen it. That red membrane, dried and ground, becomes the spice we call mace. The dark seed itself, grated against a metal surface, releases the warm, complex, slightly sweet fragrance we call nutmeg. And in the year 1511, these two substances were, pound for pound, among the most valuable materials anywhere on the surface of the earth. To understand the true weight of that claim, you need to understand what Europe was like in the 15th and early 16th century, the world that shaped the ambitions and the desperation that sent the first Portuguese ships east into waters no European cartographer had charted and no European sailor had crossed. It was a world without refrigeration, without any reliable way to preserve food beyond salting and smoking and drying, with a diet for most people that was narrow and monotonous at the best of times, and genuinely dangerous in the winter months, when fresh food was unavailable, and the preserved stores that had to carry a household through to spring were often, by February, beginning to decay in ways that no amount of willpower could ignore. Spices did not merely make food taste better, in a cosmetic sense. They masked the flavour of meat that had begun to turn. They prevented the growth of mould and bacteria in stored food through their antimicrobial properties, and they provided aromatic and medicinal benefits that were deeply valued in an era when the line between food, medicine and magic was permeable in ways we have largely forgotten. Beyond their practical utility, Spices were status objects in the deepest possible sense. To season a dish with expensive spices was to demonstrate that you could afford them, that you had access to goods that had travelled 10,000 miles through the hands of Arab merchants and Persian middlemen and Indian traders and Venetian importers before arriving on your table in London or Bruges or Lyon. The spice trade in medieval and early modern Europe was controlled by a long and expensive chain of intermediaries, each taking their margin, each adding to a price that was already extraordinary before the goods reached their final buyers. The merchant who could break that chain, who could go directly to the source and eliminate the middlemen, could theoretically undercut every competitor and still make profits that were, by the standards of the age, almost incomprehensible. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to break that chain, and they did it by the most audacious means available. They sailed around the continent of Africa. Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 and reached the coast of India, where he filled his ships with pepper and other spices, and returned to Lisbon to a reception that was, by contemporary accounts, something close to a triumph. The profit on that single voyage has been estimated at somewhere between 30 and 60 times the cost of the expedition, a return that makes even the most aggressive modern venture capital look cautious by comparison. Within a decade, Portuguese fleets had established a network of trading posts along the Indian coast and were pushing further east, following the rumours of islands where the finest spices grew in wild abundance, tended by local populations who had been trading them across Asia for centuries without European involvement. In 1511, a Portuguese fleet under the command of Afonso de Albuquerque, one of the greatest military strategists of the age of exploration, a man who combined tactical brilliance with the kind of methodical ruthlessness that turns military campaigns into lasting empires, took the great trading city of Malacca on the Malay Peninsula, and it was from there that the first Portuguese ships sailed directly into the Banda Sea. The Banda Sea is a small body of water in what is now eastern Indonesia, roughly oval in shape, bounded on all sides by larger islands and stretching perhaps 600 kilometres at its longest dimension. Surrounded by a scattering of small volcanic islands and coral reefs, it is not an impressive body of water on a map. But the Portuguese captains who first anchored in its waters and smelled the extraordinary fragrance rising from the hillside groves understood immediately that they had arrived at a place of singular importance. They were standing at the only location on Earth where nutmeg grew naturally, tended by a population of perhaps 15,000 Bandanese people who had been incorporating these trees into a sophisticated trading economy for longer than anyone could clearly remember. The Bandanese were not passive subjects waiting to be discovered and exploited. They were experienced commercial operators who had dealt with merchants from Java, Malay, China, and India for generations, and they had developed sophisticated strategies for managing the relationships between different buyers in ways that kept competition alive and prices favourable to themselves. They were not interested in giving any single foreign power a monopoly over their trade. This was not naivety but sound commercial strategy, and they pursued it with considerable skill. The Portuguese, frustrated by this independence and by their inability to enforce exclusive trade agreements against determined local resistance and the interference of other Asian merchants, attempted various combinations of military coercion and diplomacy. They built a fort on the island of Banda Neira, the largest and most accessible of the Banda Islands, and they tried repeatedly to establish the kind of exclusive trading relationship that would give them control over the nutmeg supply. They largely failed. The Bandanese were too experienced, the islands too numerous, and too difficult to blockade simultaneously, and the broader network of Asian commerce too complex for the Portuguese to dominate with the forces they could maintain at such a distance from Lisbon. But the Portuguese had established the crucial intelligence that would shape the next century of European competition in Southeast Asia. They had confirmed the exact location of the Spice Islands, they had traded in their harbours, and they had brought back in their cargo holds the proof that a direct route to the source of nutmeg and cloves was commercially viable. That knowledge, once it existed, was irresistible to every other European maritime power that was watching Portugal's growing commercial empire with a mixture of admiration and envy. It was only a matter of time before others followed. By the early 17th century, the Portuguese had been joined and then largely displaced in the eastern spice trade by the Dutch. The Dutch East India Company, known universally by its Dutch acronym, the VOC, which stood for Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, was, in its heyday, the most powerful commercial entity that had ever existed on Earth, and it is not entirely clear that anything since has matched it for the combination of commercial reach, political power, and institutional ruthlessness that it brought to the business of monopoly trade. The VOC had its own army, financed from its own revenues. It had its own navy of warships purpose-built for trade route enforcement. It had its own court system, capable of trying and executing people, its own prisons, its own currency, its own system of colonial administration across a network that stretched from the Cape of Good Hope to Japan. It was a corporation with the full powers of a sovereign state, chartered by the Dutch government and answerable to its shareholders, and it used those powers with extraordinary efficiency and extraordinary ruthlessness in the pursuit of one overriding goal: complete control of the spice trade. The VOC's most consequential man in the East was Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, who served as Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies in two separate terms between 1619 and 1629, and who was by any measure one of the most effective and most terrible administrators of the colonial era. Cohen's brilliance as a strategist and an institutional builder was matched only by the completeness with which he had divested himself of any moral consideration for the human beings who stood between the VOC and its commercial objectives. He had a vision that was clear and logically coherent and devastating in its implications. The VOC would control all the sources of the most valuable spices. It would do so by establishing such thorough physical and commercial control over the producing islands that no alternative supply chain could exist, and it would enforce that control absolutely and permanently using whatever means were necessary. No other buyers would be permitted, no other sellers would be tolerated, a complete monopoly maintained indefinitely by force. And the Banda Islands, where the only nutmeg in the world grew on trees that required specific volcanic soil and tropical humidity to thrive, were the centre of that vision. In 1621, Cohen led a fleet to the Banda Islands with the explicit intention of completing once and for all the conquest of the nutmeg monopoly that the Portuguese had failed to achieve and that the VOC itself had been attempting with incomplete success for more than a decade. What followed was not a military campaign in any conventional sense. It was not a battle between armies of comparable strength, with the outcome uncertain until the final engagement. It was a systematic extermination. Cohen had determined, based on his reading of 20 years of troubled Dutch relations with the Bandanese, that the indigenous population was inherently untrustworthy, that no agreement made with them could be relied upon, and that the only solution to the problem of Bandanese independence was the removal of the Bandanese people themselves. The campaign proceeded with methodical thoroughness. Dutch soldiers and a company of Japanese mercenaries whom Cohen had hired for their particular effectiveness in close combat moved through every island in the archipelago, island by island, village by village. They burned what they found. They killed those who resisted, and many who did not resist. People who fled into the jungle were tracked down by search parties working with dogs. Villages that surrendered were often destroyed anyway, their populations killed or enslaved and transported. Some Bandanese managed to escape by canoe to other islands in the region, and small numbers of descendants of those escapees survived and eventually returned to the archipelago in later decades. But the indigenous population of the Banda Islands, which had numbered perhaps 15,000 people when the Portuguese first arrived, was reduced by the VOC's campaign to a few hundred survivors. The anthropological consensus is that what Cohen ordered and executed was, by any reasonable modern standard, a genocide, the intentional destruction of a distinct people as such. Having emptied the islands of their people, Cohen then repopulated them according to a plan of his own devising. Dutch colonists, called perkeneers, from the word for grove, were granted parcels of nutmeg groves under a system that obligated them to sell their nutmeg exclusively to the VOC at prices set by the company. The labour force that actually worked the groves was enslaved people, imported from other parts of the Indonesian archipelago, purchased at company-controlled markets, and compelled to work under conditions that contemporary observers, even those sympathetic to the colonial enterprise, described as brutal. The VOC set the price at which it would buy nutmeg from the perkeneers. It set the penalties for selling to unauthorised buyers, which included death, and it maintained a naval patrol around the islands that made unauthorised trade effectively impossible. The monopoly was, for several decades, about as complete as any monopoly on a natural product has ever been. The profits were staggering. The markup between what the VOC paid the buccaneers for nutmeg in the Banda Islands and what it charged European buyers in Amsterdam was, at its peak, in the range of several thousand%. A pound of nutmeg that cost the company a few guilders in Banda sold for prices in Europe that reflected its status as one of the most sought-after luxury goods in the world. The Banda Islands, barely visible on even a large-scale map of Indonesia, tiny volcanic outcroppings in a remote sea, were generating profits that helped fund the Dutch Golden Age, the extraordinary cultural and commercial flowering of 17th century Holland that produced Rembrandt and Vermeer and the most sophisticated financial system the world had yet seen. The nutmeg trees of Banda paid, in some meaningful economic sense, for a substantial portion of one of the great cultural efflorescences in European history. There is a footnote to the story of the Banda Islands that is so quietly world-altering in its implications that it deserves its own extended telling. One of the 10 Banda Islands is called Run, or Pulau Run in Indonesian, and it is tiny even by the standards of an archipelago of small islands. It is less than 3 kilometres long, and perhaps half a kilometre wide at its broadest point. A sliver of volcanic land covered in nutmeg trees, rising from the Banda Sea with no particular geographical drama, easily overlooked on any map. In 1616, English merchants working for the English East India Company established a trading post on Run, and through a somewhat complicated series of agreements with the island's local rulers, the island became the first overseas territory formally claimed by the English crown, a fact that is largely forgotten in England itself, where the national mythology of empire usually begins later and elsewhere. The English and the Dutch fought over Run repeatedly and bitterly through the early and middle decades of the 17th century. The Dutch, committed to their monopoly, could not tolerate an English presence in the Banda Sea, and the English, equally committed to breaking into the spice trade, were determined to hold their foothold. Ships were seized, merchants were imprisoned, small military actions were fought around the island's harbour and on its beaches. The conflict over Run was, in miniature, exactly the kind of strategic competition over a monopoly island that we have seen playing out across the whole history of the spice trade, except that in this case, the island was so small and the conflict so apparently disproportionate that it seems, in retrospect, almost comical. By the 1660s, both sides had been fighting intermittently over these islands and other matters for so long that exhaustion had produced a genuine willingness to negotiate, and in 1667, representatives of England and the Netherlands met at Breda to settle a range of outstanding disputes. The Treaty of Breda resolved many things, but its most consequential clause was an exchange. The Dutch agreed to return to the English the colony of New Amsterdam, the settlement on the southern tip of Manhattan, island that they had established in 1626, and that had developed into a modest but functioning trading town of perhaps 1,000 people. In return, the English agreed to cede Run Island to the Dutch. The English got Manhattan. The Dutch got a 3-kilometre island covered in nutmeg trees. At the time, many people on both sides of the negotiation considered the Dutch to have made the better deal. This was not obvious commercial stupidity. It was a perfectly reasonable calculation by the standards of 1667. The nutmeg groves of Run were a known, proven, quantifiable source of commodity that sold for enormous prices in European markets. The value could be calculated from existing trade records, and it was substantial. Manhattan, by contrast, was a speculative investment in a territory whose future depended on patterns of European migration and North American development that had not yet occurred and were genuinely uncertain. The fur trade was profitable but not spectacular. The agricultural potential of the region was not yet clear. Run Island, small and remote as it was a bird in the hand. New Amsterdam was several flocks of birds somewhere in an uncertain bush. History, of course, made the English trade look very good, and the Dutch trade look like one of the greatest commercial errors in recorded history. The modest trading settlement of New Amsterdam became the city of New York, which became the largest city in the Western Hemisphere and the financial capital of the world. Run Island remained a small island in a remote sea, its nutmeg monopoly eventually broken when the French botanist Pierre Poivre managed to smuggle nutmeg seedlings out of the Banda Islands in the 1770s and establish nutmeg cultivation in other parts of the tropical world. What the exchange reveals, beyond the particular irony of its outcome, is the extraordinary valuation, that a monopoly island commanded in the commercial imagination of the 17th century. The Dutch were willing to give up what would become the greatest city in the Western Hemisphere in exchange for a handful of kilometres of volcanic soil covered in fragrant trees, because that volcanic soil represented a proven, controllable, enforceable monopoly, and monopolies, not potential, were what empires valued most. If you were a European statesman in the year 1700, and someone asked you to identify which of your overseas territories generated the most value for your empire, the answer would almost certainly not be a continent. It would not be the vast and largely uncharted wilderness of North America, whose fur trade was profitable, but whose agricultural potential was still unrealized. It would not be the enormous and complex subcontinent of India, where European trading companies were still operating largely as commercial guests of local powers, not yet as territorial rulers. No, the most valuable piece of real estate that any European empire controlled in 1700 was almost certainly a small Caribbean island, and the substance that made it valuable was not gold or silver or spice, but something white and crystalline and addictive, something that had not existed in the European diet before the colonization of the Americas made its cultivation economically viable: sugar. Sugar in the 17th and 18th centuries occupied a place in the European economy that requires some effort to fully appreciate, because we live in a world in which sugar is cheap and ubiquitous and barely remarked upon. In the early modern period, sugar was simultaneously a luxury good and an increasingly addictive one, the kind of substance that, once people began consuming regularly, they found it very difficult to do without. It was used as a medicine, as a preservative for other foods, as a flavouring for drinks that were becoming increasingly important in European social life. Coffee and tea and chocolate all tasted dramatically better with sugar, and as a pure luxury, a way of demonstrating wealth through the extravagance of sweetening things that did not need to be sweet. European demand for sugar grew continuously and rapidly throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, and the price that it commanded was high enough to make the Caribbean islands that produced it extraordinarily, almost incomprehensibly profitable. Barbados sits at the eastern edge of the Caribbean Sea, roughly 34 kilometres long and 23 kilometres wide, pear-shaped and coral-based rather than volcanic, with a terrain that is relatively flat compared to many other Caribbean islands, and therefore more amenable to the large-scale mechanised agriculture that the sugar economy required. The English arrived in 1627, finding a fertile landscape that had been stripped of its indigenous Arawak population by earlier Spanish slaving expeditions. For the first decade, English settlers tried various crops: tobacco, cotton, indigo, with results that were commercially viable but not spectacular. Then, in the 1640s, Dutch merchants who had been expelled from their sugar-producing colony in Brazil arrived in Barbados, bringing with them not just knowledge of how to grow and process sugar, but the capital investment, the equipment, and the commercial connections that allowed the sugar industry to establish itself quickly and completely. The transformation of Barbados in the 2 decades after sugar was introduced was one of the most dramatic economic and social upheavals in the history of European colonization. In 1645, the island's population was mostly white English settlers, growing various crops on relatively small holdings. By 1680, the island had been almost entirely converted to sugar production, on large plantations. The small white farmers had largely been bought out or driven out by the increasing capital requirements of the sugar economy, and the population was predominantly enslaved Africans. By some estimates, 10 enslaved people for every free white person. The island's economy had been completely restructured around a single crop, and that crop made Barbados, for several decades, the most productive and profitable colony in the English-speaking world. The economics were of a kind that defied the intuitive sense of proportion. A well-run sugar plantation on Barbados could generate annual returns of 20, 30 or even 40% on the capital invested. Figures that, in an era when a safe European investment might return 5 or 6%, represented extraordinary wealth creation. By the late 17th century, Barbados was generating more trade value for England than all of the North American colonies combined. A small island that you could drive across in an hour was outperforming Virginia and Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and all the rest of the American seaboard. Not because Barbados was more fertile or more extensive, but because sugar was worth so much more per acre than anything that North America was producing, and because the labour system of enslaved people, horrifying as it was in every moral dimension, was economically efficient in the narrowest and most brutal sense of that word. France and England, the long war for the Sweet Islands, the extraordinary profitability of Caribbean. Sugar production was not a secret, and other European powers entered the Caribbean sugar business as quickly as their resources and political situations allowed. France established sugar colonies in Martinique and Guadeloupe, two islands in the Lesser Antilles, as well as in the western portion of the island of Hispaniola, which became the colony of Saint-Domingue. Spain had been in the Caribbean since Columbus, but had focused its attentions on the gold and silver of mainland America rather than the slower accumulation of agricultural wealth. The Dutch had their own sugar operations in Suriname on the South American coast. By the early 18th century, the Caribbean had become, in economic terms, one of the most intensively contested commercial zones in the world, with European powers competing for islands the way that modern corporations compete for market share. The competition was not merely commercial, it was military, and it was continuous. The wars of the 18th century, the War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, the American Revolutionary War, all had Caribbean theatres in which French and English, and sometimes Dutch and Spanish fleets fought for control of specific islands and island groups. The Caribbean was not a sideshow to these conflicts. For the commercial classes who financed European governments through loans and tax revenues, it was often the main event. An admiral who captured a sugar island had accomplished something of immediate and quantifiable economic value. An admiral who won a battle on the continent might shift the balance of land forces in ways that would take years to translate into commercial benefit. The sugar lobby was, by the mid-18th century, one of the most powerful political forces in the British Parliament. The West India interest, as the coalition of planters, merchants, and financiers whose wealth derived from Caribbean sugar was collectively known, had the money and the connections to shape legislation, to influence appointments, to block measures that threatened their interests, and to advocate for policies that protected their monopoly on the British sugar market. When military decisions affected the Caribbean, the West India interest was consulted. When peace negotiations approached, the West India interest had opinions about which islands should be kept and which could be traded away, and those opinions were listened to with the deference that political systems throughout history have extended to concentrated wealth. The 7 Years' War and the Great Trade of 1763. The conflict that historians call the 7 Years' War was fought between 1756 and 1763 across multiple continents and multiple oceans, involving almost every major European power in shifting combinations, and it was, in the fullest sense, the first genuinely global war in human history. It was fought in Central Europe between Prussia and Austria, in India between French and British trading companies and their local allies, in West Africa for control of slaving stations, in North America between French Canada and the British colonies, and in the Caribbean, where the most economically valuable colonial possessions in the world were at stake. Britain entered the war late but prosecuted it with extraordinary effectiveness under the direction of William Pitt the Elder, who understood that naval power was the decisive lever of the conflict and invested accordingly. By the war's end in 1763, Britain had captured Quebec from France, had expelled French power from most of India, had taken Havana from Spain, and had captured the French Caribbean islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe. The peace negotiations that produced the Treaty of Paris in 1763 were among the most commercially significant diplomatic proceedings of the century, and at their heart was a choice that reveals with perfect clarity how 18th century empires valued territory. Britain had to decide what to keep and what to return. It could not keep everything it had taken. A peace that left France and Spain with nothing would be no peace at all but merely a pause before the next war. Some concessions had to be made. The question was which ones. The debate over Guadeloupe versus Canada became, briefly, one of the most public and passionate economic arguments of the age. The case for keeping Guadeloupe was straightforward and compelling by the standards of the time. It was a proven sugar producer. Its value could be calculated precisely from existing trade records, and incorporating it into the British sugar system would increase the empire's agricultural output and commercial revenue substantially. Canada, by contrast, was cold, vast, sparsely populated. The French-Canadian population numbered perhaps 70,000 souls, and its economic potential was largely theoretical. The fur trade was profitable but limited. The agricultural potential of the Saint. Lawrence Valley was not yet fully developed. Canada was, in the commercial language of the age, a speculation. Guadeloupe was a certainty. Benjamin Franklin, writing from the perspective of someone who lived in North America and who understood what Canada meant for the future of the British colonies there, argued powerfully for Canada. Without Canada in British hands, French power would remain a permanent threat on the northern and western frontiers of the colonies, limiting their expansion and their security. Franklin's argument was strategic and demographic. Canada mattered for what it would allow the colonies to become, not for what it was generating at that moment. The sugar lobby argued the opposite, that present and calculable value should take precedence over speculative future potential. In the end, Britain kept Canada and the smaller islands of the Lesser Antilles, returning Guadeloupe and Martinique to France. The West India interest was not entirely happy. They had feared competition from French sugar if those islands had been incorporated into the British system, and that consideration had actually worked against keeping them. But the strategic argument for Canada eventually prevailed. The decision shaped the future of North America in ways that nobody in 1763 could have predicted. Without French power on the northern border, the British colonies no longer needed British military protection quite so urgently, and the tensions that produced the American Revolution became possible in ways they would not have been if France had retained Canada. Once again, a decision about islands, whether to keep Caribbean islands or a Canadian subcontinent, set in motion consequences that rippled forward through history for centuries. Saint-Domingue and the Revolution that remade the Americas. No story of Caribbean islands and imperial power is complete without a full reckoning of Saint-Domingue, the French colony that occupied the western third of the island of Hispaniola, and that was, in the late 18th century, not merely the most productive sugar colony in the world, but arguably the most productive piece of agricultural real estate, measured in output per acre, that had ever existed. Saint-Domingue generated at its peak roughly 40% of Europe's entire sugar supply and more than half of its coffee. It made the French Empire in the Caribbean dramatically wealthier than any of its rivals. The port city of Cap Français, on the island's northern coast, was known as the Paris of the Antilles, a cultured, prosperous, sophisticated city built on the labour of 500,000 enslaved people who had no legal standing, no recognised humanity, and no recourse against any violence their owners chose to inflict upon them. The colony existed in a state of extraordinary productive tension that was also a state of permanent moral catastrophe. The prosperity of Saint-Domingue was absolute, quantifiable and real. The suffering that produced it was equally absolute, equally quantifiable and equally real. The work on a sugar plantation was physically brutal in ways that broke the body within a few years. The cutting of cane with machetes in tropical heat, the processing of the cut cane in the sugar mill with its boiling cauldrons and its grinding machinery that took fingers and hands from workers who lost their grip for a moment, the absolute subordination to the will of an overseer who could inflict punishment without limit or review. The average life expectancy of an enslaved person imported to Saint-Domingue from Africa was perhaps 7 to 10 years from the moment of arrival. The colony maintained its workforce not through natural increase, but through continuous importation from Africa. Tens of thousands of new enslaved people every year, just to keep the workforce at its required level. The revolution that began on the night of August 21st, 1791, in the hills above the northern plain, was the result of a combination of factors that had been accumulating for years. The ideology of the French Revolution, which proclaimed liberty and equality, but had explicitly declined to extend those principles to the enslaved people of the colonies. The organizational capacity of the enslaved population, which had its own internal hierarchies and communication networks and cultural institutions built around Vodou religious practice. And the particular spark of that night's ceremony at Bois Caillemont, where enslaved leaders made a covenant, spiritual and political simultaneously, to rise together. Within days, the northern plain of Saint-Domingue was burning. The fires were visible from ships far out at sea. The most productive sugar colony in the world was destroying itself in an act of revolutionary violence that had no precedent in the history of the Atlantic. The leader who emerged from that chaos was Toussaint Louverture, a man whose life had prepared him, in ways that could not have been anticipated for exactly the role that history was about to demand of him. Born into slavery around 1743, he had been given unusual latitude by a relatively enlightened owner, had taught himself to read from whatever books he could find, had absorbed the Stoic philosophy that was fashionable among educated men of his era, and the principles of Enlightenment thought about liberty and natural rights, and had worked as a coachman and then a livestock manager, roles that gave him experience of logistics and organisation that would prove invaluable. When the revolution began, Toussaint was nearly 50 years old, a slight man with an extraordinary gift for physical endurance and a strategic intelligence that his enemies, even those who hated him most, were eventually forced to acknowledge. Toussaint fought first against the Spanish colonizers of the eastern part of Hispaniola, then alongside the Spanish against the French, then switched back to the French side when France abolished slavery in 1794, then eventually moved toward effective independence as he consolidated control over the entire island. He defeated British expeditionary forces that were sent to take advantage of the chaos and seize Saint-Domingue for the British Empire, forces that lost tens of thousands of men, mostly to yellow fever, in a campaign that was one of the most costly disasters in British imperial history. He outmaneuvered French representatives, Spanish officials, American commercial interests and local rivals with a political sophistication that contemporary observers found remarkable, and that historians have continued to study with admiration. He was, by any measure, one of the great political and military figures of the revolutionary era, the equal in talent if not in ultimate success of Napoleon Bonaparte himself. Napoleon was the man who finally brought Toussaint down. In 1801, with the Treaty of Amiens giving France a temporary peace with Britain, Napoleon sent his brother-in-law General Leclerc to Saint-Domingue with the largest military expedition France had ever sent across the Atlantic, perhaps 40,000 soldiers in the first wave with more to follow, and orders to restore French authority, reimpose slavery, and neutralize Toussaint. The campaign began well for the French. Toussaint was eventually captured through treachery. He came to a meeting under a flag of truce and was arrested, and transported to France, where he died of cold and deliberate neglect in a mountain prison in April 1803. But the revolution he had set in motion could not die with him. The black generals who had fought under him, Dessalines, Christophe, Pétion, continued the struggle, and the yellow fever that had killed the British was killing the French at the same rate. Leclerc himself died of it. Replacements arrived and died. By the end of 1803, the French army in Saint-Domingue had essentially ceased to exist, not through military defeat, alone but through the combination of guerrilla warfare and disease that the island's climate and the revolutionaries' determination imposed upon every European army that attempted to hold the colony by force. On January 1st, 1804, the revolutionary leaders declared independence, naming the new nation Haiti, a word from the indigenous Taino language meaning mountainous place. It was the second republic in the Western Hemisphere, the first nation in history to be born of a successful slave revolution, and its birth sent shockwaves through every slaveholding society in the Americas, from Brazil to Virginia, where planters and politicians spent the next 6 decades in a state of barely suppressed terror at the possibility that what had happened in Haiti might happen to them. The loss of Saint-Domingue ended Napoleon's ambitions for a French empire in the Americas. Without that jewel as the anchor of a transatlantic commercial empire, Louisiana, the vast French territory in North America that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico north toward Canada, had no strategic purpose. Napoleon needed money for his European wars, and a territory he could not defend and could not develop was worth more to him as cash than as real estate. In 1803, he sold Louisiana to the United States for $15 million in one of the most consequential real estate transactions in history. The purchase roughly doubled the territory of the United States, opening the interior of the North American continent to American expansion, and setting in motion the continental destiny that the country would pursue throughout the 19th century. That purchase, and the American expansion it enabled, traces directly to the Haitian Revolution, to the enslaved people on a Caribbean island who decided that their freedom was worth fighting for, and who proved that they were right. There is an island in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea that appears, on a sufficiently detailed map, to have been placed there by someone with a precise understanding of strategic geography. Malta sits at roughly the centre of the Mediterranean, almost equidistant between the Strait of Gibraltar to the west and the eastern end of the sea at the Levantine coast. It commands the channel between Sicily and North Africa, a channel perhaps 90 kilometres wide at its narrowest point, through which virtually all maritime traffic between the eastern and western Mediterranean must pass. The island is not large. The main island of Malta is roughly 316 square kilometres, and together with its sister islands of Gozo and Comino, the archipelago totals about 316 square kilometres, but its harbours are among the finest natural anchorages in the Mediterranean, deep and well sheltered, capable of accommodating large fleets through the roughest winter storms. Whoever controlled Malta controlled the central Mediterranean. This fact has been understood with greater or lesser clarity by every maritime power that has ever operated in that sea. The Phoenicians understood it, establishing trading contacts with Malta perhaps as early as 750 BCE. The Romans understood it. They called the island Melita and used its excellent harbour as a naval base during the Punic Wars. The Arabs who conquered the island in 870 AD understood it, holding it for 2 centuries and leaving traces in the Maltese language that persist to this day. Maltese is a Semitic language, unique in Europe, descended from the Arabic dialect of the medieval Arab settlers, blended with Norman French and Italian elements that accumulated in subsequent centuries. The Normans who took the island from the Arabs in 1091 understood it, and the chapter of Maltese history that has most thoroughly captured the imagination of subsequent generations began in 1530, when the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V granted the island to an institution that had been fighting the Ottoman Empire across the eastern Mediterranean for more than a century and had recently been expelled from its previous base, the Knights of St. John, also known as the Hospitallers. The Knights of St. John were a religious military order of a kind that had become almost anachronistic by the 16th century. They had originated in the 12th century as a hospital service for Christian pilgrims in Jerusalem, had become a military force during the Crusades, and had survived the fall of the Crusader kingdoms by transforming themselves into a maritime power based first in Cyprus, then in Rhodes, which they held from 1309 until the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman expelled them in 1522. They arrived at Malta reluctantly, finding it a poor and ill-watered island compared to the fertile Rhodes they had just left, with a population of about 12,000 people living in conditions of considerable poverty. Grand Master Philippe de Villiers, de l'Isle Adam, who led them through the first years on Malta, was reportedly not impressed. But the island was what they had, and with the systematic thoroughness that characterized their order, they began to make the best of it. Over the following decades, working with skilled military engineers and funded by the substantial revenues that the order collected from its properties across Europe, the Knights transformed Malta's natural harbour complex, a great harbour, and several adjoining creeks and inlets on the northeastern coast of the island, into one of the most heavily fortified positions in the entire Mediterranean world. They built forts at the harbour entrances, walls along the shorelines, towers on the island's high points, and a system of signal fires and watchtowers that could warn of approaching fleets from considerable distances. They maintained a navy of galleys that was small but experienced, staffed by knights who spent their careers at sea and who were, individually, among the most skilled sailors and fighters in the Mediterranean, and they waited as they had been waiting since their founding for the next assault from the Ottoman Empire. The Great Siege of 1565, 4 months that shook the world. The assault came in May 1565. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the same ruler who had expelled the Knights from Rhodes 43 years earlier, now in the last years of a reign that had made the Ottoman Empire the most powerful state in the known world, sent a fleet of approximately 190 ships, carrying an army of between 30,000 and 40,000 men to finish what he had started at Rhodes. The commander of the fleet was Piale Pasha, an experienced admiral. The army on shore was commanded partly by Mustafa Pasha, a veteran of many campaigns, and they faced on the island Grand Master John de Valette, a man of 70 years old who had first come to Malta more than 40 years earlier, who had been an Ottoman galley slave for a period after being captured at sea, and who had spent every year of his long life in preparation for exactly this moment. De Valette had perhaps 500 knights and something between 6,000 and 8,000 soldiers and Maltese militia, a force vastly smaller than the Ottoman army that had just landed on his shores. He had adequate artillery and considerable fortifications, but he also had no certainty of relief. The Spanish Viceroy of Sicily, the closest potential source of military assistance, was cautious about committing his forces and would not send the relief army that was Malta's only hope until the siege had already lasted months. De Valette knew all of this. He fortified his positions, distributed his forces, sent urgent messages to every Christian monarch in Europe, and prepared to hold as long as it was humanly possible to hold. The Ottomans began their assault on Fort St. Elmo, a relatively small fortification at the tip of the peninsula that separated the two main harbour areas. St. Elmo was expected by Ottoman calculations to fall within 5 or at most 7 days. It had a garrison of perhaps 1,500 men, and the Ottoman army could bring overwhelming artillery to bear on it from the surrounding high ground. The fort held for 31 days. The fighting was so intense, so continuous, and so costly that the knights inside were rotating men from the main defences to St. Elmo on small boats at night, because the garrison was being killed faster than it could sustain itself. Every man who went into St. Elmo in those last weeks knew that he was going to die there. They went anyway. When the fort finally fell on June 23rd, every defender was dead. The Ottomans had lost, by their own accounts, more than 8,000 men taking it. Mustafa Pasha, surveying the ruins and counting his losses, is reported to have said something to the effect of, "If so small a son has cost us so dear, what will the father cost us?" He was looking at the main fortifications of Birgu and Sengler across the harbour, the actual stronghold of the knights and the Maltese population, and understanding that St. Elmo had been merely the prelude. The siege ground on through July and August, through the brutal heat of the Mediterranean summer, through assault after assault that came in waves of men climbing siege ladders and being cut down by the defenders and being replaced by more men climbing more ladders. The Ottomans brought up their artillery and conducted a bombardment of sustained ferocity. Contemporary accounts describe a day in late August when the Ottoman guns fired more than 6,000 cannon rounds between dawn and dusk, and the noise could be heard clearly on the Italian mainland. De Valette fought on the walls himself, an old man in full armour in the Mediterranean summer heat, setting an example that his exhausted and dwindling garrison could not fail to follow. When members of the Orders Council suggested late in the siege that the surviving population and defenders might attempt to break out by sea and evacuate to safety, de Valette's response was absolute. There would be no retreat, no abandonment of the island that the order had been given to defend. If the island fell, they would fall with it. This was not romanticism, but strategy. A retreat would confirm that Malta was indefensible, would hand the Ottomans the central Mediterranean, and would end whatever remained of Christian naval power in that sea. They would hold, or they would die. The relief force arrived on September the 7th, a Spanish army of perhaps 8,000 men that had finally been dispatched from Sicily by the Viceroy, who had received urgent orders from King Philip II of Spain. The Ottomans, by then deeply worn down by months of fighting, by epidemic disease that had run through their crowded camp, and by the approaching winter that would make the Mediterranean increasingly dangerous for their fleet, chose to withdraw. They had not been defeated militarily. They still outnumbered the defenders substantially. But the combination of unexpected resistance, their own mounting losses, and the arrival of the relief force made continued operations impractical. The fleet re-embarked the army and sailed north and east. Malta had held. The news of the Great Siege's outcome spread across Christian Europe with a speed and emotional intensity that is difficult to fully appreciate from the distance of 4.5 centuries. It was announced from pulpits and celebrated in the streets of Rome, Madrid, Venice, Lisbon, and Paris. The Pope ordered a special Mass of Thanksgiving. Philip II of Spain donated enormous sums to the rebuilding of Malta's defences. Donations poured in from across Europe, from monarchs and merchants and ordinary people who understood, even without modern communications technology, that something important had just happened. that the seemingly unstoppable westward advance of the Ottoman Empire had been checked, at least for now, by the stubborn courage of a small garrison on a limestone island in the middle of the sea. De Valette used the donations to do something that has outlasted every fort and every cannon of the siege. He built a new city on the peninsula where Fort St. Elmo had stood and from which Malta had been defended. He named it Valletta for himself, immodestly but understandably, and its design was entrusted to military engineers who built it as a city intended to withstand siege, with streets laid out in a rational grid pattern, with bastions and counterscarps and all the sophisticated fortification technology of the 16th century incorporated into the urban fabric from the very beginning. Valletta still stands today, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, its honey-coloured limestone buildings and narrow streets still exactly as its founders designed them, an extraordinary living relic of the moment when a tiny island's defenders stopped an empire in its tracks. Napoleon walks in, Nelson fumes, and Britain takes the key. For 2 more centuries Malta remained the fortress home of the Knights of St. John, growing more elaborate in its fortifications and more comfortable in its daily life as the direct military threat from the Ottoman Empire gradually receded. The Knights became, over those centuries, as much a diplomatic and commercial power as a military one, owners of substantial property across Europe, operators of a sophisticated banking system, patrons of the arts in ways that filled their conventual church in Valletta with masterworks by Caravaggio and other great painters of the era. They were an institution of the medieval world persisting with increasing oddness into the modern one. Napoleon Bonaparte, sailing east with the army of Egypt in June 1798, had no patience for medieval oddities that stood between him and his strategic objectives. He needed to water his fleet and he needed a Mediterranean base, and Malta, positioned exactly where it was positioned, was the obvious answer. He sent a message to the Grand Master requesting permission to enter the harbour with his ships. The Grand Master, Ferdinand von Hompesch, a German aristocrat more notable for his administrative qualities than his military ones, declined, citing the order's neutrality. Napoleon responded by landing troops. The Knights, their military force aged and demoralised, their Maltese subjects unwilling to fight for an institution that had governed them with increasing remoteness and condescension, offered essentially no resistance. The island fell in a matter of hours. Napoleon reorganised the administration, transferred the Knights' treasure to his own use, stayed for 6 days, and sailed on for Egypt. The French occupation that followed was chaotic and increasingly unpopular. French administrators, implementing revolutionary principles, began appropriating the church property that formed the backbone of Maltese social and economic life, and the Maltese, who had endured centuries of knights without particular enthusiasm, but had at least understood what they were, rose in revolt within months. They appealed to the British, whose Mediterranean fleet under Rear Admiral Horatio Nelson was already looking for any opportunity to undermine French power in the region. Nelson imposed a naval blockade. The French garrison, cut off from supply and surrounded by a hostile population, slowly ran out of options. In September 1800, the French commander surrendered to the British, and Malta passed into British hands. Nelson's understanding of what he held is expressed in a letter that captures the strategic intuitions of the naval era with complete precision. He wrote that he considered Malta to be, taken all in all, of the very greatest importance, and he was not engaging in casual hyperbole. For the British Empire, which was in the process of consolidating its dominance of the world's sea lanes in the wake of the French Revolutionary Wars, Malta was the key to the Mediterranean, a base from which the Royal Navy could reach in almost any direction, project force against any coastal power in that sea, and supply and support operations across an enormous geographic range. The Congress of Vienna formally recognised British sovereignty over Malta in 1814, and the island remained a British Crown colony and the home of the Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet until 1964, serving in both World Wars as a strategic asset of the First Order. During the Second World War from 1940 to 1942, Malta endured a sustained aerial bombardment that tested its population in ways that recalled, across a gap of nearly 4 centuries, the Great Siege of 1565, Axis aircraft, German and Italian, flying from bases in Sicily, North Africa and elsewhere, attacked Malta with an intensity and regularity that has few parallels in the history of air warfare. More bombs fell on the small island over those 2 years than on the City of London during the entire Blitz. The harbour installations that were Malta's strategic purpose were targeted continuously. The civilian population, in the ancient tradition of the island, took shelter in the limestone catacombs and tunnels beneath their cities and emerged when they could to continue their daily lives in the rubble. The island's supply convoys were attacked by Axis submarines and aircraft, and several were nearly entirely destroyed, reducing Malta's food supplies to the point where rationing approached starvation levels. King George VI awarded the entire island the George Cross in April 1942, an unprecedented extension of the highest civilian honour to a whole population, recognising that what Malta was enduring was not merely the hardship of wartime, but something closer to the sustained siege that the island had survived in 1565. The Pacific Ocean is, by any measure, an almost incomprehensible space. It covers more than 165 million square kilometres, an area larger than all the world's landmasses combined, and at its widest it stretches nearly 20,000 kilometres from the coast of Indonesia to the coast of Colombia. Crossing it under sail took months of hardship that tested even the most experienced and well-provisioned crews to their physical and psychological limits. In the age before reliable charts and navigational instruments, simply surviving the crossing was an achievement. Finding a specific island in that vast emptiness required skills of navigation, reading stars, ocean currents, the flight patterns of birds, the colour and temperature of the water, that Polynesian and Micronesian sailors had developed over thousands of years of Pacific voyaging, and that European navigators were only beginning to acquire when they first pushed into those waters in the 16th century. Scattered across the Pacific's vast expanse, like punctuation marks in an endless and otherwise featureless sentence, are thousands of islands. Some are volcanic, dramatic cone-shaped peaks rising from the ocean floor through thousands of meters of water to break the surface in formations of stark beauty, surrounded by the coral reefs that grow in the warm, clear, nutrient-poor waters of the tropics. Some are coral atolls, the remnants of volcanic islands that have subsided below the surface over geological time, while the coral reefs that grew around them have continued to build upward, leaving ring-shaped structures of coral enclosing a shallow central lagoon, barely breaking the surface of the ocean, some rising only a metre or two above high tide level. Many are inhabited, have been inhabited in some cases, for 3,000 or 4,000 years by peoples whose ancestors arrived in extraordinary voyages of deliberate navigation across thousands of kilometres of open ocean. For most of the era of European expansion, these islands were regarded as interesting curiosities rather than strategic prizes of the first importance. They lacked the commodity density that made Caribbean sugar islands worth fighting over. They lacked the geographic monopolies that made the Banda Islands and Ceylon worth killing for. They were simply too remote, too scattered across too vast a space, too difficult and expensive to supply and defend to justify the investment of formal colonization for purely commercial purposes. European powers established themselves in the Pacific, Spain in the Philippines and the Marianas, Britain in Australia and New Zealand, France in Polynesia, Germany in parts of Melanesia and Micronesia. But the smaller islands of the central and western Pacific remained, for most of the 19th century, commercially marginal places where missionaries, traders, and the occasional naval vessel were the extent of European presence. What changed everything was the development of long-range air power in the 20th century, and specifically the development of the aircraft carrier, a warship that carried its own fleet of aircraft, capable of projecting offensive power across distances of hundreds of kilometres in every direction from the ship's position. In the age of the aircraft carrier, an island in the middle of the Pacific was no longer merely a piece of land in a remote location. It was a potential airstrip. It was a base from which aircraft could refuel and rearm and extend the offensive reach of naval power across distances that, in the age of sail or even early steam power, would have been impossible to bridge. The coral atolls and volcanic peaks that had seemed strategically irrelevant became, in the calculations of military planners in the 1930s and 1940s, among the most contested real estate on Earth, and the battles that were fought for them were among the most savage and costly in the history of warfare: Guam, the Philippines, and the collision of Pacific empires. Spain had been the dominant European power in the Pacific for 300 years when the system collapsed. From their base in Manila, in the Philippine archipelago, a vast island nation of more than 7,000 islands that they had first claimed in 1565, naming it for their King Philip II, and held through 3 centuries of rebellions, pirate raids, Dutch challenges, and the ordinary attrition of colonial administration, the Spanish had controlled the Manila galleon trade, one of the great commercial enterprises of the early modern world. Ships sailed annually from Acapulco on the Mexican coast, carrying silver mined by indigenous labourers in Bolivia and Peru across the Pacific to Manila. From Manila they returned with silk and porcelain and other goods from China and throughout Asia, completing a circuit that pumped enormous quantities of American silver into the Asian economy and funded Spanish imperial ambitions on multiple continents. Guam, the southernmost of the Mariana Islands, lay directly on the galleon route as the critical mid-Pacific stopping point, where ships could take on fresh water and food before the final leg to or from Mexico. The Chamorro people who had lived on Guam for perhaps 4,000 years found their island transformed, without their meaningful consent, into a refueling station for an empire whose existence they had not previously been aware of. Spanish missionaries arrived in 1668, and the subsequent decades brought population collapse, cultural disruption, and the imposition of colonial administration of the kind that was being repeated across the Pacific and the Americas simultaneously. In 1898, the United States declared war on Spain over Cuba and the Cuban independence movement that had been struggling against Spanish colonial rule. The war was brief and decisive in almost every theatre. In the Pacific, Commodore George Dewey sailed his Asiatic squadron into Manila Bay on the morning of May 1st, 1898, and in the course of a single morning engagement destroyed the Spanish Pacific Fleet without losing a single American ship. A few weeks later, an American warship appeared off Guam and fired on the Spanish fort there. The Spanish commander, who genuinely had not heard that a war had started, rowed out to the American ship to apologize for the lack of a proper cannon salute and to explain that the fort had no powder. He was politely told that he was a prisoner of war. At the Treaty of Paris that December, Spain ceded the Philippines, Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States for $20 million, a sum that seems remarkable for territories of that size and strategic value, and that reflected Spain's complete loss of leverage in the negotiation. The acquisition was not universally celebrated in the United States. The debate over whether to take the Philippines in particular was intense and philosophically serious. Many Americans felt that a republic that had declared its independence from colonial rule had no business establishing colonies of its own. Mark Twain wrote savagely against Philippine annexation. Andrew Carnegie offered to buy the Philippines himself and set them free. But the logic of strategic geography: once you controlled Manila Bay and the Philippine archipelago, you needed Guam to supply that possession, and once you had Guam, you were a Pacific power with Pacific interests to protect, proved, as it has always proved, stronger than the philosophical objections. The United States became, whether it wished to or not, a Pacific island empire. Midway. The battle that turned the war, Midway Atoll sits approximately 1,800 kilometers northwest of Hawaii, at the northwestern end of the Hawaiian island chain, in the middle of the North Pacific Ocean. Its total land area is approximately 6.5 square kilometers, 2 small coral islands enclosed within a larger reef and lagoon system. It has no indigenous human population. It is, ecologically, one of the world's great seabird colonies, home to the largest population of lace and albatrosses in existence. Enormous birds with wingspans of over 2 meters that spend most of their lives at sea and return to Midway to breed in numbers that are literally beyond easy counting. In June 1942, Midway became the site of a naval battle that is widely regarded as the turning point of the war in the Pacific, a battle fought over a coral atoll for reasons that were entirely strategic and that determined, in those 4 days of furious combat, which country would control the Pacific Ocean for the remainder of the 20th century. Japan's strategy in the Pacific after Pearl Harbor was based on establishing a defensive perimeter of islands that would be held against American counterattack, while the conquered territories, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, Burma, were incorporated into a self-sufficient imperial economic zone that could sustain the war indefinitely. Midway, at the edge of that perimeter's eastern limit, was identified by Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku as the key to the next phase of the campaign. If Japan could take Midway and use it as an advance base, it could threaten Hawaii itself and force the United States to negotiate rather than continue the war. It was an ambitious plan, and it might have worked if American cryptanalysts had not broken the Japanese naval code and were not therefore waiting with their remaining aircraft carriers for exactly the fleet that Yamamoto was sending. The Battle of Midway was fought between June 4th and 7th, 1942. The decisive moment came on the morning of June 4th, when American dive bomber squadrons from the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown found the Japanese carrier force at a moment when the Japanese flight decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled in a state of maximum vulnerability. In the space of approximately 5 minutes that have been called, by historians of the Pacific War, the most consequential 5 minutes in the history of naval combat, American dive bombers put enough bombs into 3 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, to doom all 3. A 4th carrier, Hiryu, survived the initial strike and launched counterattacks that damaged and eventually sank the American carrier Yorktown, but Hiryu herself was found and destroyed later that afternoon. Japan had gone into the battle with 4 fleet carriers. It emerged with none. The 4 carriers sunk at Midway had been the core of the strike force that attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Their experienced aircrews and aircraft could not be replaced quickly enough to restore Japan's offensive capability in the time frame the strategic situation demanded. The initiative in the Pacific passed to the United States, never to return to Japan. And all of this, the entire turning of the Pacific War, happened over a coral atoll of 6.5 square kilometers, populated mostly by albatrosses in the middle of a vast ocean, because that atoll was, in the calculations of naval air power, a piece of territory whose control mattered enormously. The island hopping campaign, violence and geography. The campaign that followed Midway lasted 3 years and covered thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean, and it was conducted according to a strategic logic that was as geographically determined as anything in the age of sail. To defeat Japan, the United States needed to bring its air power and ultimately its ground forces close enough to the Japanese home islands to make continued Japanese resistance impossible. The Pacific Islands that stood between Midway and Japan were not obstacles to be bypassed. They were assets to be captured and converted into the bases from which the next stage of the advance could be launched. Each island taken was an airfield gained, an anchorage secured, a step closer to the ultimate objective. The strategy was called island hopping, not because every island was attacked, but because the chain of capture and advance moved progressively along the island chains of the Western Pacific. The islands that had to be fought for were defended by Japanese soldiers who had been trained to regard surrender as a dishonorable act forbidden by the military code and by direct imperial injunction. They fought with a tenacity that the American forces found, at first, astonishing and then simply accepted as the given condition of every engagement. Tarawa Atoll in November 1943, barely 3 square kilometers of coral, cost nearly 1,000 American dead and more than 2,000 wounded in 76 hours of fighting. Peleliu in 1944, an island of 11 square kilometers, cost more than 1,700 American dead and 8,000 wounded in a campaign that lasted over 2 months, and that some commanders, after the fact, questioned whether it needed to be fought at all. Iwo Jima, 21 square kilometers of black volcanic sand, cost 6,821 American dead and nearly 20,000 wounded in 36 days, and the Japanese garrison of approximately 21,000 men was, by the battle's end, almost entirely dead. The photograph taken on Iwo Jima of Marines raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi became one of the defining images of the war, an image of effort and sacrifice and accomplishment over a landscape that is, stripped of its historical context, simply a volcanic island, barely large enough to accommodate the battle being fought on it. Okinawa, the last great battle before the proposed invasion of Japan itself, was fought on the largest of the Ryukyu Islands, an island of approximately 1,200 square kilometers that sits roughly 550 kilometers southwest of the Japanese home island of Kyushu. The battle lasted from April 1st to June 22nd, 1945, and its casualty figures reflect the scale of what had been at stake throughout the island-hopping campaign. Approximately 12,000 American dead, more than 36,000 wounded, an estimated 100,000 Japanese military dead, and somewhere between 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians dead, a number that reflects the particular tragedy of the Okinawan people caught between two military forces and suffering proportionately more than almost any civilian population in the Pacific War. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, and Japan's subsequent surrender were, among other things, the American political leadership's response to the casualty projections for the invasion of the Japanese home islands that Okinawa's battle had made starkly clear. The Falkland Islands resist being called beautiful in any conventional sense, though they have a stark and particular quality that their inhabitants and a certain kind of visitor find deeply compelling. They are cold, rarely above 15 degrees Celsius even in the southern hemisphere summer, frequently much colder with a wind that comes off the south. Atlantic and the Southern Ocean with a persistence and force that has shaped everything on the islands. From the vegetation, tough grass and peat bog, no trees anywhere on the main islands, to the architecture, low, solid, built to resist rather than to invite, to the character of the people who have chosen to make their lives there. They lie roughly 480 kilometres east of the southern tip of Argentina, at a latitude of about 51 degrees south, the same latitude in the northern hemisphere as central England, but without England's moderating oceanic current and with weather that reflects the unimpeded circulation of the Southern Ocean rather than the Gulf Stream's warming influence. There are two main islands, East Falkland and West Falkland, and several hundred smaller islands, islets, and rocks scattered across an area of ocean that is, at its extremes, perhaps 250 kilometres across. The total land area is approximately 12,000 square kilometres, roughly the size of the English county of Yorkshire. When Argentina's military junta ordered the invasion in April 1982, the island's total civilian population was approximately 1,800 people, mostly of British descent, mostly sheep farmers, mostly living in the capital Stanley on the eastern coast of East Falkland, or in the scattered farms across the island interior. There were, by most estimates, several times more sheep than people. Argentina's claim to the islands, which they call the Malvinas, rests on a combination of geographic, historical and legal arguments that are not in fact entirely without merit, which is part of what makes the dispute so intractable. The argument from geography is straightforward. The islands lie on the Argentine continental shelf close to the Argentine coast and seem by natural logic to belong within the Argentine sphere. The historical argument is more complex. Argentina claims inheritance of Spanish sovereignty over the islands from the colonial era, pointing to a Spanish settlement established in 1764 and to agreements with France that had briefly also claimed the islands. Britain established its own claim from the 1760s, maintained a settlement intermittently, and asserted continuous sovereignty from 1833, when a British naval vessel expelled a small Argentine garrison that had been established there and reasserted British control. The legal argument turns on disputed interpretations of exactly those events, and of international legal principles regarding territorial inheritance from colonial powers. What is not in dispute is that the roughly 1,800 British settlers who lived on the islands in 1982 wanted to remain British, wanted it with considerable passion and consistency, and had been expressing that desire clearly and continuously whenever the question was raised. The Argentine junta, faced with deep domestic unpopularity arising from economic crisis and the revelations of the dirty war atrocities of the late 1970s, decided that a quick, military victory to recover the Malvinas would unite the country, restore the junta's popularity, and achieve a goal that Argentine nationalism had been pursuing for generations. General Leopoldo Galtieri, the junta leader, expected that Britain would not send a military force across 13,000 kilometres of ocean for 1,800 people and some sheep. He was wrong about this in a way that proved fatal to both his military adventure and ultimately to his government. Britain sent 127 ships and 28,000 men to the South Atlantic under the command of Admiral Sandy Woodward for the naval forces and a series of land commanders for the ground troops. The task force that assembled at Ascension Island and then sailed south was by any measure an extraordinary logistical achievement, a major amphibious operation mounted in weeks, at extreme range, in waters that the Royal Navy had not seriously operated in for decades. The fighting that followed, when the task force reached the islands in late April and early May, was intense and costly on both sides. The Argentine Air Force, flying super-étendard jets armed with Exocet missiles purchased from France, sank 2 British destroyers and several other vessels in attacks that came very close to breaking the British operation. British Special Forces and Parachute Regiment troops fought hard engagements at Goose Green and across the mountainous terrain of East Falkland. The Argentine forces, many of them young conscripts poorly equipped for the cold and wet conditions, fought with varying effectiveness but often with considerable courage. The Argentine garrison in Stanley surrendered on June 14, 1982, 74 days after the initial invasion. The total British dead numbered 255. The total Argentine military dead numbered 649, with 3 Falkland Island civilians also killed during the fighting. The disproportion in casualties reflected the difference in air and naval capability rather than any difference in individual courage. Argentina's military government collapsed within months of the defeat, replaced by a democratic government that has renounced force as a means of resolving the dispute, but has not renounced the claim itself. The sovereignty question is formally frozen, pending eventual negotiation, and the parties have not negotiated in any meaningful sense since 1982. What the Falklands War demonstrated, more clearly than almost any other conflict of the late 20th century, is that the logic of island control had not become obsolete in the modern era. Britain sent its ships south not for reasons of sentimental attachment to 1,800 farmers, though the genuine desire of those farmers to remain British was a real factor, but because an island position at the Drake Passage, commanding the approaches to Antarctica and the southern routes between the Atlantic and Pacific, was worth defending on strategic grounds that had nothing to do with sheep. The oil reserves that have since been confirmed in the surrounding seabed were suspected in 1982 and have become, in the decades since, a significant additional reason why the island's strategic value is real and not merely nominal. The Falklands in 2025 are not the Falklands of 1982. They are a community of nearly 4,000 people, with a fishing industry, a growing hydrocarbon sector, and a relationship to the surrounding ocean that is both economically and strategically significant. The cold wind still blows across the peat bog, the penguins still tend their eggs, and the strategic logic that sent a task force south across the Atlantic has not evaporated. Look at a map of South Asia and let your eye travel south from the Great Triangle of the Indian subcontinent, past the flat green delta of Tamil Nadu, past the shallow turquoise waters of the Palk Strait, and you will find an island that has been called, for so long that the metaphor has become almost invisible, the pearl of the Indian Ocean. The island now called Sri Lanka has a shape that supports the comparison, roughly teardrop-shaped, broader at the north and tapering to a point at the south, its outline suggesting something pendant and precious, something that hangs in the ocean the way a jewel hangs from a chain. It is not an enormous island, perhaps 430 kilometres from north to south and 220 kilometres at its widest, but it has been, for the past 500 years, one of the most coveted pieces of territory in the entire Indian Ocean world, desired and contested by every empire that operated in those waters, for reasons that begin with a tree and ramify outward into the full complexity of global history. Cinnamon, true cinnamon, the inner bark of the Cinnamomum verum tree, carefully peeled in thin curling strips from the young branches by workers of hereditary caste who had developed the technique over generations, grew in the 16th century almost exclusively in the coastal lowlands of Ceylon's southwestern coast. There were other plants that European merchants sold under the name cinnamon, cassia from Indonesia, Vietnamese cinnamon, various other related species, but connoisseurs and physicians who actually knew the commodity could tell the difference, and they would pay premium prices for Ceylon cinnamon that they would not pay for the substitutes. It had a particular fineness of flavour, a warmth and sweetness without the harsher edge of cassia, that made it not merely a flavouring but a medicinal ingredient of high value in a pharmaceutical system that relied heavily on aromatic plants, and it grew naturally, in its finest form, only on this one island. The Portuguese arrived in 1505, having heard reports of the island's extraordinary cinnamon from Asian traders in India. A damaged fleet sought shelter and found, instead, something far more interesting. A coastline fragrant with cinnamon carried on the warm air, a population divided among several competing kingdoms that might be played against each other, and a harbour deep enough for their ships. Within a few years, Portuguese merchants had established commercial relationships with the King of Ceuta, the most powerful of Ceylon's coastal kingdoms, and within a few decades they had built forts at Colombo and other coastal points, and had established the administrative framework of a colonial presence. The cinnamon peelers, the Salagama caste, whose hereditary knowledge of the peeling technique was the literal foundation of the spice's commercial value, were compelled to supply fixed quotas of cinnamon bark to Portuguese buyers at prices set by the colonial authority, and the profits flowed back to Lisbon. The Portuguese never conquered the whole island. The Kingdom of Kandy, in the island's mountainous interior, resisted every Portuguese military expedition sent against it, using the terrain with the skill of defenders who had lived in those hills for generations, and who understood that an army struggling up narrow mountain paths through jungle was an army at a fundamental disadvantage regardless of its weapons and training. Kandy survived Portuguese occupation of the coast for a century and a half, and it was Kandy's king who eventually called in the Dutch to help expel the Portuguese, a call that the Dutch East India Company answered with enthusiasm, because the cinnamon trade that the Portuguese controlled was exactly the kind of monopoly that the VOC had been organised to seize. The Dutch and the Kandian forces expelled the Portuguese from the coastal lowlands between 1638 and 1658, and the Dutch then discovered, as the Portuguese had before them, that the Kandian king had no intention of simply transferring the Portuguese monopoly to the VOC. The agreement that had brought the Dutch to Ceylon had promised them favourable trading conditions in exchange for their military assistance. Kandy's interpretation of favourable conditions was somewhat different from the VOC's interpretation, and the tensions that resulted would persist throughout the Dutch period of coastal occupation. The Dutch, like the Portuguese before them, held the coast and the cinnamon trade but could not penetrate the interior. They managed the cinnamon monopoly with VOC efficiency, conducting periodic surveys of the cinnamon-bearing areas, setting production quotas, maintaining the exclusivity of the trade through a combination of legal restrictions and naval patrol, and the profits were, while not quite at the level of the nutmeg operation in Banda, substantial and continuous. The British completed the sequence in 1796 when the French Revolutionary Wars and Napoleon's reorganisation of Europe made the Dutch Republic effectively a French satellite, and British naval policy dictated that French satellite territories in strategically important locations should be denied to France. Ceylon's strategic importance had, by 1796, expanded beyond cinnamon. It was a crucially located naval base in the Indian Ocean, commanding the approaches to both the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea, positioned to support British operations in India and to threaten French and Dutch commercial interests across the region. The British took the coastal territories from the Dutch with minimal resistance, and then, in 1815, accomplished something that neither the Portuguese nor the Dutch had managed. They defeated Kandy, incorporated the Highland Kingdom into the colonial structure, and for the first time in the island's recorded history, a single power governed the entire island. Ceylon remained British for 133 years, through the transformation of its economy from cinnamon to coffee to tea, through the development of plantation agriculture that brought Tamil workers from South India and left a demographic legacy that contributed to the ethnic tensions that produced the civil war of the late 20th century, through 2 world wars in which Ceylon served as a crucial base for British operations in Asia and the Indian Ocean. The island gained independence in 1948 as Ceylon and became the Republic of Sri Lanka in 1972. The cinnamon trees still grow in the southwestern coastal lowlands. The Salagama peelers' descendants still practice their art, and the teardrop shape of the island still hangs in the Indian Ocean, as it has always hung, at the junction of the trade winds and the monsoon, exactly where geography placed it, and where empire after empire found it, coveted it, and fought to hold it. In the spring of 1768, the Council of the Republic of Genoa, a body of patrician merchants governing a small and increasingly exhausted Italian city-state, made a decision that was, from their perspective, purely practical. Genoa had controlled Corsica, the large Mediterranean island off the Italian coast, for several centuries, and that control had been, for most of those centuries, more trouble than it was worth. The Corsicans were not a passive population. They had resisted Genoese rule with periodic uprisings throughout the colonial relationship, and the most recent rebellion, led by a remarkable figure named Pasquale Paoli, who had established a functioning independent republic on the island and governed it with considerable skill and genuine popular support from 1755 onward, had proven impossible to suppress without French military assistance. Genoa owed France substantial sums for that assistance. France was willing to accept, in lieu of debt repayment, the sovereignty of Corsica itself. The transaction was complete by May 1768. Corsica was sold to France for 40 million livres, the debt was cleared, and Genoa washed its hands of an island it had never quite managed to govern. Paoli continued to fight the French for about a year with the forces of his republic, but the French army was too large and too well equipped for the Corsican militia to defeat in open battle, and by June 1769 organised Corsican resistance had collapsed. Paoli himself went into exile in London, where he was welcomed by English intellectuals who admired his experiment in republican government. James Boswell had visited Corsica in 1765 and written an enthusiastic account of Paoli's republic that had made Paoli briefly famous across Europe, and where he remained for more than 20 years. The island was reorganised under French administration. The Corsican language and customs were tolerated, but French law and French language became the framework of the new colonial relationship. On August 15, 1769, just 14 months after the French takeover, a period barely long, enough for the new administration to have established itself on the island, a woman named Maria Letizia Ramolino gave birth, in a house on the Rue Saint-Charles in the coastal town of Ajaccio, to her second surviving son. The family was of minor Corsican nobility, not wealthy, not powerful in any way that would have been visible to an observer, but educated and ambitious. The boy was named Napoleon di Buonaparte, in the Corsican and Italian style. He grew up bilingual in Corsican and Italian, in a household that was keenly aware of its Corsican identity and of the recent loss of independence, before being sent at the age of 9 to a military school on the French mainland, where he learned French with an accent that would always mark him as not quite native, and where the combination of intellectual brilliance and social outsideness that would characterise his entire career first manifested. The connection between the Genoese sale of Corsica and Napoleon's subsequent career is not a matter of speculation or retrospective pattern finding. It is a simple causal chain. Had Corsica remained Genoese, or had Paoli's republic survived, Napoleon Bonaparte would not have been born a French citizen. He could not have attended the Royal Military Schools of France, could not have received a French officer's commission, could not have risen through the ranks of the French Revolutionary Army, an army whose extraordinary social mobility, enabled by the Revolution's destruction of the aristocratic monopoly on officer ranks, was precisely what allowed a Corsican minor noble of no particular wealth to rise to become General Bonaparte, then First Consul, then Emperor. Every institution that Napoleon moved through required French citizenship. French citizenship required the sale of 1768. The sale of 1768 required Genoese bankruptcy and French ambition in the Mediterranean. The consequences of that chain extend in almost every direction that matters in modern Western history. The Napoleonic Code, which Napoleon imposed on the territories under French control, and which influenced the legal systems of dozens of countries, including through the Louisiana Purchase much of the United States, would not exist without Napoleon. The reorganization of Europe that Napoleon enforced created the conditions for the nationalist movements of the 19th century that eventually produced unified Germany and unified Italy and the modern map of Europe. The wars that Napoleon fought killed somewhere between 3 and 6 million people across the continent. The political philosophies that emerged in response to Napoleon, conservative reaction, romantic nationalism, the first articulations of modern liberal democracy, shaped the intellectual and political world of the 19th and 20th centuries in ways that are still active, and all of it, this enormous edifice of consequence, rests at its foundation on the Genoese Republic's need to balance its books in 1768. Corsica itself remains French to this day, though with a degree of autonomy and a persistent nationalist movement that has, in various periods, and with varying intensity, demanded either greater autonomy or full independence. The island that produced Napoleon has, perhaps inevitably, never quite reconciled itself to being French, has maintained its own language, its own cultural identity, its own complex relationship to the mainland that governs it. Pasquale Paoli, who went into exile in 1769 and returned briefly in the 1790s when the French Revolution seemed to offer an opportunity for a new Corsican independence, is celebrated today as the father of the Corsican nation in a way that Napoleon, who was born on the island but quickly stopped being of it, is not quite celebrated. History has given Corsica the more famous son. The island remembers the one it actually chose, off the East African coast in the warm and luminous waters of the Western Indian Ocean. The islands of Zanzibar rise from the sea with a particular grace of places that have been beautiful for a very long time and have become accustomed to being looked at. Unguja, the main island, usually called Zanzibar after the archipelago as a whole, is roughly 90 kilometres long and 30 kilometres wide, flat and coral-based. Its coastline alternating between beaches of fine white sand backed by coconut palms and mangrove forests threading their complicated root systems into the shallow tidal waters of the bays and inlets. The smaller island of Pemba, north of Unguja, is hillier and more dramatic in its topography, with a lushness of vegetation that comes from its higher rainfall and that gives it a particular quality of green, deep, saturated, the green of places where things grow quickly and abundantly without encouragement. The smell of Zanzibar is, even today, remarkable. Cloves drying in the sun, the sweet sharp fragrance cutting through the warm sea air, the smell of spices mixed with the salt and the wood smoke of cooking fires, and the complex marine smell of the harbour. This olfactory landscape is what greeted every visitor to Zanzibar for most of the 19th century, and what drew every empire that operated in the Indian Ocean to desire a piece of the islands and their trade. Stone Town, the old commercial heart of Unguja's western coast, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site now, its narrow winding streets and tall coral stone buildings preserved with care, the famous carved wooden doors that are a signature of Swahili Arab architecture restored and maintained for the visitors who come from everywhere to walk through a city that has been trading with the world for more than 1,000 years. The Arab merchants of Oman had been trading along the East African coast for centuries before they established more permanent political control, but it was the early 18th century that saw the Omani Sultanate, specifically the Ya'arubi dynasty, and then the Al Said dynasty, establish dominance over the coastal trading cities from Mogadishu in the north to Mozambique in the south. Zanzibar was the jewel of this East African commercial empire, its natural harbours excellent, its position on the monsoon circuit ideal, its agricultural land fertile and well-watered. The slave trade that passed through Zanzibar was one of the largest in the world for much of the 18th and 19th centuries, not the transatlantic slave trade that carried people from West Africa to the Americas, but the Indian Ocean slave trade that carried people from the African interior east to Arabia, Persia, India, and throughout the Islamic world. A trade that was ancient, deeply embedded in the commercial structures of the region, and that the British Empire spent most of the 19th century attempting to suppress. The cloves that transformed Zanzibar's economic identity arrived in the 1820s, brought by Sultan Said of Oman as a part of a deliberate effort to develop the agricultural productivity of his East African territories. Said was one of the most effective rulers of the Age of Transition, a man who understood that the world was changing, that European powers were increasingly present in the Indian Ocean, that the old trading patterns were under pressure, and that developing new forms of productive capacity on his most valuable island was the best response to that pressure. He ordered clove seedlings planted across the available agricultural land of Unguja and Pemba, offered tax incentives to landowners who converted to clove production, and moved his entire court from Muscat to Zanzibar in 1840, effectively making the island the capital of a maritime empire that stretched from Oman to the East African coast, and that had commercial relationships reaching throughout the Indian Ocean world. By the 1860s and 1870s, the results of Said's initiative were extraordinary. Zanzibar and Pemba together were producing in some years as much as 3/4 of the world's entire clove supply, a monopoly position that, while less complete than the nutmeg monopoly the Dutch had maintained in Banda, was substantial enough to make Zanzibar the pricing centre for cloves in every market in the world. Ships came from Europe, America, India, Arabia and China to load Zanzibar cloves. The port was one of the busiest in the Indian Ocean. The commercial wealth generated flowed into Stone Town, into the Sultan's palace, into the merchant houses of the Omani and Indian trading families who dominated the commercial life of the city, and into the broader economy of the coast. Zanzibar was, in the mid-19th century, one of the most significant commercial entrepôts in the entire Indian Ocean world. It was also a centre of the slave trade that the British Empire had committed itself, with genuine moral seriousness if mixed practical results, to suppressing. The Royal Navy maintained an anti-slavery patrol in the Indian Ocean, and British diplomats negotiated a series of treaties with the Sultanate that progressively restricted and eventually banned the slave trade. The first treaty, in 1822, banned the trade to territories east of a certain longitude. Subsequent treaties progressively tightened the restrictions. The slave trade continued anyway, through evasion and enforcement gaps, until near the end of the 19th century. The story of British anti-slavery policy in the Indian Ocean is a complicated one, a genuine moral commitment operating within the framework of imperial strategy, with results that were partially effective at considerable cost, and that also served British commercial and political interests in ways that do not diminish, but do complicate the moral credit. The Sultan's Last Morning. The 38-Minute War. In August 1896, Sultan Hamad bin Thuwaini died in his palace in Stonetown, and his nephew Khalid bin Bagash moved immediately and decisively to claim the succession. The problem was that the Anglo-Zanzibar Treaty of 1886 required the Sultan's successor to be approved by the British consul before taking office, and Khalid had not sought or received that approval. The British consul, Sir Basil Cave, sent Khalid a message informing him that his accession was not recognised and demanding that he stand down. Khalid's response was to barricade himself in the palace complex, surround himself with whatever armed force he could assemble, his personal guard, various palace functionaries, and perhaps 2,500 men in total, armed with a collection of weapons ranging from the modern to the antique, and prepare to resist. The British assembled a squadron of 5 warships in the harbour, the cruisers St. George, Philomel, Thrush and Sparrow, and the dispatch vessel Raccoon, and positioned them with their guns trained on the palace complex and the surrounding harbour area. The old wooden royal yacht, the HHS Glasgow, was moored by the palace and manned by some of Khalid's supporters, with a small number of ancient cannons. The situation had a certain theatrical quality that was entirely consistent with the late Victorian imperial style, the overwhelming naval power visible in the harbour, the British officials ashore delivering ultimatums in formal diplomatic language, the isolated figure of the would-be sultan inside his palace, trying to calculate whether anyone was actually going to open fire. The ultimatum expired at 9 o'clock in the morning of August 27, 1896. At 9:02 the British warships opened fire. The Glasgow was hit almost immediately and caught fire. It sank within minutes, its crew abandoning ship as it went down. The palace buildings were struck by shell fire from the cruisers and began to burn. The defenders, armed with weapons that included at least 1 Gatling gun and various small arms, returned fire in a way that was brave but entirely futile against the weight of broadside artillery being brought to bear against them. At 9:40, 38 minutes after the bombardment began, Khalid's flag was hauled down from the palace. Khalid himself had already fled through a back entrance and was making his way to the German consulate, where he sought asylum. The fighting was over. The casualty figures were appropriately asymmetrical. Approximately 500 of Khalid's men were killed or wounded. No British sailors were killed, though one was wounded. A new sultan, Hamad bin Mohammed, who had indicated his willingness to work within the framework of the British Protectorate, was installed within hours. The British consul sent his report to London. The newspapers reported it as a minor colonial incident, and the world moved on. The 38-minute war entered the historical record as the shortest international war ever fought, where it remains today, a somewhat absurd footnote to the larger story of how Zanzibar came to be firmly within the British imperial system. What the 38-minute war illustrates beyond its evident comedy is the complete asymmetry of power that characterized the late Victorian imperial relationship. The way in which a major European empire, when it chose to exercise force to maintain its position, could do so with a precision and speed that left no room for local resistance. The clove monopoly that made Zanzibar worth controlling had not declined. If anything, global demand for cloves had grown as food preservation and flavouring markets expanded. The strategic position of the island on the Indian Ocean trade routes remained important, and the British were not prepared to allow those assets to pass into uncertain hands because of a succession dispute that they could resolve in 38 minutes. The logic of island control, operating at full efficiency in the steam and shell era. There is a body of water in Southeast Asia that is, by almost every measure of contemporary geopolitics, the most contested maritime space in the world. The South China Sea covers roughly 3.5 million square kilometres, an area somewhat larger than the Mediterranean and the Caribbean combined, and its shores are claimed by 9 separate countries. Through it passes approximately 1/3 of the world's entire maritime trade, the oil tankers carrying Persian Gulf petroleum to the energy-hungry economies of China, Japan, South Korea and Taiwan, the container ships carrying the manufactured goods of China, Vietnam, Malaysia, and a dozen other manufacturing centres to markets across the globe, and the naval vessels of multiple nations that patrol its waters, conduct exercises, shadow each other's ships, and occasionally confront each other in encounters that are brief and carefully managed, but that nonetheless carry the possibility of escalation that haunts every strategist who studies the region. The South China Sea's islands and reefs are not impressive to look at. The Spratly Islands, scattered across the southern portion of the sea, in a loose collection of more than 100 individual features, islands, cays, reefs, shoals, banks, are mostly barely visible at the surface of the water, most of them uninhabited in any permanent sense, most of them valuable primarily for what surrounds them, rather than for what they are in themselves. The Paracel Islands in the northwestern portion of the sea between Vietnam and China are somewhat more consolidated, a pair of island groups with a combined land area of perhaps 8 square kilometres. But they are not by any geographic standard impressive, and yet they are claimed in various configurations by China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei and Taiwan, and the disputes over them have generated the most sustained and most potentially dangerous diplomatic and military friction in the Asia-Pacific region for the past 3 decades. Understanding why requires understanding what they control. Beneath the seabed of the South China Sea lie petroleum reserves whose extent is genuinely disputed. Estimates range from the modest to the substantial, depending on the methodology used and the political context of the estimating body, but which are certainly significant enough to matter in the energy calculations of countries that import most of their oil from distant sources. The fishing grounds of the South China Sea have sustained the coastal populations of Vietnam, China, the Philippines, and other surrounding countries for centuries, and while they are now deeply overfished, they remain economically important to millions of people whose livelihoods depend directly on their access. The shipping lane value of the sea is, as noted, enormous and quantifiable in ways that the other resources are not. And then there is the purely military strategic dimension which has grown dramatically since the development of long-range cruise missiles, nuclear submarines, and the precision strike capabilities that have transformed what an island base in the middle of a sea can actually do. An island in the South China Sea, equipped with radar installations, anti-ship missile batteries, and a runway long enough to support combat aircraft, can cover an enormous area of ocean. It can threaten any ship that passes within several hundred kilometres. It can provide the forward air presence that gives a navy the ability to operate in waters far from its home ports without relying on aircraft carriers alone. For China, which is developing exactly the kind of blue water navy that would benefit from such forward basing, the islands of the South China Sea represent a strategic asset of the first order, the difference between a navy that can operate freely in its own maritime neighbourhood and one that has to fight its way out of the first island chain before it can project power anywhere meaningful. Building islands, claiming history. The approach that China has taken to resolving the South China Sea dispute in its favour is, as noted earlier, without precise historical precedent. The literal construction of islands from material that was not previously above the waterline, beginning around 2013 and accelerating rapidly through 2014 and 2015, Chinese dredging vessels, purpose-built for exactly this operation, some of the largest in the world, moved into the Spratlys and began pumping sand and coral from the seabed onto submerged reefs, creating new land where none had existed. The scale of the operation is extraordinary. In the space of approximately 2 years, China created more than 3,000 acres of new land on 7 different features in the Spratlys alone, at an estimated cost of billions of dollars. On these new islands, military construction proceeded at speed. Runways long enough for combat aircraft, hangars, radar domes, missile, batteries, barracks, harbours deep enough for naval vessels. What had been submerged reefs became, in the space of a few years, functioning military bases in the middle of the South China Sea. The international response was strong in its legal condemnation and limited in its practical effect. The Philippines brought a case before an international arbitration tribunal under UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and in July 2016 the tribunal issued a ruling that was broadly favourable to the Philippines, finding that China's historical claims based on the so-called 9-line, a demarcation that China uses to claim approximately 80 to 90% of the South China Sea, had no basis in international law, and that China's island construction activities in the Philippines' exclusive economic zone were violations of Philippine sovereign rights. China rejected the ruling entirely, declining to participate in the arbitration process and refusing to recognise its outcome. The ruling changed nothing on the ground, or rather in the water. The artificial islands remain, the military installations remain. Chinese Coast Guard and naval vessels continue to operate throughout the disputed waters, and no country has the combination of interest, capability, and political will to physically reverse what China has built. The United States conducts what the Pentagon calls freedom of navigation operations, sending naval vessels through waters that China claims in order to assert, under international law, that those claims are not recognized and that the waters are international. China responds to these operations with diplomatic protests, with shadowing vessels that maneuver close enough to make the American crews uncomfortable, and occasionally with more aggressive actions that have included maritime militia vessels, fishing boats crewed by paramilitary personnel operating under the direction of the Chinese Coast Guard surrounding and blocking vessels from the Philippines and Vietnam. The situation is, at any given moment, several misunderstandings away from an incident that could escalate into something more serious. Everyone involved knows this. Everyone involved is also, for reasons of national pride, strategic calculation, and domestic politics, committed to a position from which retreat would be seen as weakness. Vietnam's position is particularly complex and historically resonant. Vietnam has its own historical claims to portions of the South China Sea that predate any Chinese documentation, and it has maintained its own small garrisons on various spratly features, despite pressure and occasional violence from Chinese vessels. The relationship between Vietnam and China is one of the longest and most complicated bilateral relationships in Asia, a relationship of cultural influence and political conflict that stretches back 2,000 years, and that includes a period of Chinese imperial control of Vietnam that lasted approximately 1,000 years before the Vietnamese expelled the Tang dynasty's administrators in 939 AD. Vietnam fought a brief but bloody war with China in 1979, just 4 years after the end of the Vietnam War with the United States, and the memory of that conflict sits uneasily beside the economic interdependence that makes the two countries important trading partners. Vietnam's South China Sea policy navigates this complexity with considerable diplomatic skill, maintaining its claims, accepting Chinese economic investment, and keeping its powder dry in ways that reflect the pragmatism of a small country that has survived in the shadow of a much larger neighbour for most of its history. The South China Sea in the 2020s is what the Banda Sea was in the 1600s, and what the Caribbean was in the 1700s, and what the Mediterranean was in the 1500s, a body of contested water where a rising power is asserting control, where existing powers are resisting that assertion, where the rules are being written in real time through the daily interactions of ships and aircraft and diplomatic notes, and where the outcome will determine who controls one of the world's most strategically vital maritime corridors for the remainder of the current century. The technology of power is different. Radar and missiles and satellites and undersea sensors have replaced cannon and fortification and signal fires, but the underlying logic is unchanged. Islands matter. The sea around them matters. The power to control the movement of ships through those waters matters enormously, and the nations that understand this will continue to fight for the islands by whatever means are available to them. We have travelled, over the course of this night's long story, from the volcanic islands of the Banda Sea to the coral islands of the Caribbean, from the limestone fortresses of the Mediterranean to the black sand beaches of the Pacific, from the tea-damp hills of Ceylon to the clove-fragrant shores of Zanzibar, from the cold peat bogs of the South Atlantic to the contested reefs of the South China Sea. In each of these waters, in each of these centuries, we have found the same fundamental phenomenon. Islands, often very small, often lacking any obvious natural endowment beyond their geographic position, becoming the objects of desire and violence and diplomatic obsession on the part of the world's great powers. The question that has run through all of these stories like a thread is always the same. Why? What is it about islands specifically that has made empires fight for them with such consistency and such intensity across 500 years of recorded history? The first and most fundamental answer is geographic, and it operates at a level that is almost mathematical in its clarity, and that has not changed between the age of the Portuguese galleon and the age of the nuclear submarine. The world's oceans are not uniform spaces, they are not featureless expanses across which ships and planes can move with equal ease in any direction. They have structure, they have choke points where geography forces all maritime traffic through a narrow passage, and they have open sea lanes where traffic concentrates because those routes are the most efficient connections between important ports. Islands that sit at or near these choke points, that command the view of every ship passing through, that can position artillery or aircraft or missile batteries to threaten or control that traffic, have a form of strategic leverage that no continental territory can replicate. You can bypass a country, you cannot bypass a strait, and an island that commands a strait has leverage over everything that passes through it, which in an era when most of the world's trade moves by sea, means leverage over an enormous proportion of the world's economic activity. The second answer is about logistics, about the simple fact that fleets and armies operating far from home need to eat and drink and resupply. In the age of sail, a warship consumed prodigious quantities of food, water, rope, canvas, and timber in the course of a long voyage, and it needed to resupply at intervals measured in weeks, or at most, a few months. An empire that could not provide its ships with safe anchorages and supply depots at regular intervals along its trade routes could not maintain those routes against any adversary willing to attack them. In the age of coal and then oil, the calculus changed in detail but not in principle. Steamships needed fuel, and the fuel had to be stored somewhere accessible. In the age of aviation, aircraft needed fuel and ordnance and maintenance facilities, and they needed them at intervals that were even shorter, geographically, than ship resupply had required. Islands that provided these things, at the right positions along the strategic corridors, were worth almost any price to naval planners because without them, the fleet simply could not operate at the ranges that empire required. The third answer is about monopoly, and it requires thinking about the specific geography of natural resources. The most valuable commodities that drove early modern empire, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, and later sugar, happened to grow in specific places with specific climates and soils, and those places happened to be islands. This was not coincidence in any cosmic sense. It was the result of evolutionary and climatic processes that had, over thousands of years, produced plant species adapted to specific island environments, and that had made the cultivation of those species outside those environments either impossible or drastically less productive. An island that was the only source of a particular commodity was not merely economically valuable. It was a natural monopoly of extraordinary durability, because the monopoly was enforced not by legal or military means alone, but by the fundamental facts of climate and soil. No European monarch could order nutmeg trees to grow in England, no matter how much he might have wished to. The trees grew in Banda, and therefore Banda was irreplaceable, and therefore Banda was worth killing for. The fourth answer is psychological and political, and should not be dismissed as less real than the geographic and economic factors. Islands are discrete and identifiable in a way that pieces of continental territory are not. An island has a name, a coastline, a character that is legible on a map. You can point to it. You can sail around it and comprehend its boundaries in a way that is simply not possible with a valley or a river basin or a stretch of plain. For the purposes of imperial political communication, for the maps that hang in government offices and the flags that are raised to demonstrate possession and the dispatches that announce victory, islands are perfect units. Losing an island is visible. Gaining an island is demonstrable. The politics of empire have always been partly a politics of maps, and islands are the most legible elements of any maritime map. There is also, beneath all of these practical considerations, something that might be called the psychology of the horizon. Islands, seen from a ship, appear out of the ocean as something both promised and surprising. A resolution of the featureless sea into a specific, named place with specific known characteristics. For sailors who had spent weeks or months in that featureless expanse, the sight of an island was associated with water and food and safety and rest. with the end of a particular kind of anxiety that is hard to imagine if you have never been at sea long enough to feel it. Islands, in the deep imagination of maritime cultures, are places of arrival, of completion, of the sea's violence resolved into the earth's stability. This association, which runs through the mythology and the literature of every culture that has spent time at sea, may be one reason why islands seem to command an emotional investment on the part of the people who fight over them that exceeds what any purely rational strategic calculus would dictate. Why the pattern persists into the modern world. If the logic of island control is so clear and so consistent, if it operates so reliably across 5 centuries and multiple technological eras, why has it not been superseded by some more rational arrangement, some international agreement that manages the world's strategic waterways in the common interest, reducing the incentive for individual nations to seize and fortify specific pieces of maritime real estate? The honest answer is that such arrangements exist in the form of international law and the institutions that support it, but that they operate only as long as the nations involved believe their long-term interests are better served by cooperation than by unilateral action. When a rising power calculates that the rules of the existing international order were written by others to serve others' interests, the temptation to revise those rules, by fait accompli if necessary, by building an island where none existed before, becomes very difficult to resist. The geographic constants that have driven island competition throughout history have not changed. The Strait of Malacca, through which approximately 80,000 ships pass every year carrying more than a quarter of the world's traded goods, is still flanked by exactly the same combination of islands, peninsulas and coastlines that flanked it when the Portuguese first sailed through it in 1511. The Persian Gulf exit is still what it has always been. The Drake Passage, the Mozambique Channel, the various straits and channels of the Indonesian archipelago, all of these geographic features are unchanged. The islands that command them are the same islands. Only the technology of power projection has changed, and technology, as we have seen, consistently increases, rather than decreases the strategic value of the islands that are positioned at geographic choke points, because each new technology of war adds new capabilities to whoever controls those positions. It would be tempting, from the comfortable vantage point of the early 21st century, to imagine that we have somehow transcended the logic of island competition, that the global economy's integration, the development of international law, the existence of nuclear deterrence, and the genuine costs of interstate conflict have made the kind of island grabbing that characterized previous centuries obsolete. The South China Sea, where artificial islands are being built as we sleep, suggests otherwise. The Falklands, where a war was fought within living memory, suggests otherwise. The various frozen and unfrozen maritime disputes that persist around the world. Between Japan and China over the Senkaku/Diaoyu Islands. Between Japan and South Korea over the Dokdo/Takeshima Rocks. Between various Aegean island groups claimed by Greece and contested by Turkey, all suggest that the underlying dynamic is unchanged. The technology of power changes. The geography does not. And as long as geography creates strategic choke points, and those choke points are commanded by islands, empires, or the nation-states that have replaced them, will find reasons to fight over the islands. There is a quality to islands at night that has no equivalent in any other landscape on Earth. On a continent, even the most remote continental landscape is embedded in something. There are roads, somewhere, that lead to towns, that lead to cities, that lead to the accumulated electrical glow of civilization pressing against the dark. But on a small island, on a truly small island, the kind we have been visiting tonight, the darkness at night is complete. Stand on the shore in the hours after midnight and look out to sea, and there is nothing between you and the horizon but water. And nothing between the horizon and the stars but the clean, unmediated dark. The ocean absorbs the light, the sky gives it back, and the island sits in its ancient familiar position in the ocean, surrounded by the same water that has always surrounded it, under the same stars that navigators from the Banda Sea to the Caribbean to the Pacific have used to find their way to its shores for thousands of years. Somewhere out there in the Banda Sea, the nutmeg trees still grow on the slopes of the small volcanic islands that once held the world in their fragrance. Some of those trees are old, genuinely old, in the way that only very slow-growing plants in very stable climates can be old, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches carrying generations of accumulated growth, their root systems extending deep into the volcanic soil that the VOC's Perkineers once parcelled out to Dutch colonists who ran them with enslaved labour. The Bandanese people who first tended these trees are gone, in the sense that the culture and civilization they had built before 1621 was destroyed, but the descendants of the survivors who escaped the massacre have returned to the archipelago over the centuries, mixed with the descendants of the colonists and the enslaved workers and the traders and sailors who came after, and the islands are inhabited again, lived in again, in a relationship with the nutmeg trees that is no longer one of monopoly and coercion, but simply of ordinary human connection to the land and its products. The trees grew before empire arrived. They are growing still. In the Caribbean, the islands that built the sugar empire are now sovereign nations, or autonomous territories, or dependencies of their former colonial rulers, each with its own accommodation with the past, its own ongoing negotiation between what was done to these islands and what the people who live on them are making of their present and future. Barbados became a republic in 2021, removing the British monarch as head of state in a ceremony that was managed with grace and dignity on all sides, completing a process of independence that had formally begun in 1966. The sugar economy that made Barbados the most valuable piece of real estate in the English-speaking world for a century is gone. The last sugar factory closed in 1985, replaced by tourism and financial services, and a diversified economy that has made Barbados one of the most prosperous and stable small countries in the developing world. The soil that was carved into plantations and worked by hundreds of thousands of enslaved people is now a landscape of suburban houses and tourist hotels and small farms and the occasional ruined windmill tower that once powered the sugar grinding machinery and now stands as a monument to a particular kind of economic history. Malta's harbour lights reflect in water that has been crossed by 10,000 years of human navigation, Phoenician merchants, Roman warships, Arab dhow, captains, Crusader galleys, Ottoman war galleys, Napoleonic frigates, Royal Navy destroyers, and the vast container ships that now move through the Mediterranean carrying the goods of a globalised economy. The limestone walls that Jean de Valette built after the Great Siege still stand around Valletta, their honey-coloured stone glowing in the streetlights and the tourist floodlights, their bastions intact, their gates still marking the same passages through the same walls that they marked 4.5 centuries ago. The cannons are in museums. The military harbour is still operational, though it serves the armed forces of a small neutral republic rather than the fleet of a colonial empire. The strategic importance of Malta's position in the central Mediterranean is unchanged, though the maritime powers that care about it are different from those of 1565 or 1800 or 1942. The island persists, as it has always persisted, in its specific position in the sea, doing what islands do, being exactly where geography placed it, for whoever happens to need it. In the Pacific, the islands that were bought with the most terrible currency of all, the lives of young men who had travelled from American farming towns and Japanese coastal villages to fight each other on coral atolls in the middle of an ocean neither of them had ever seen before, are mostly at peace now, mostly healing, mostly trying to construct in the present the kind of life that the mid-century catastrophe interrupted. Midway Atoll is a wildlife refuge administered by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. The runways where American planes landed after the battle that changed the war are still there, though used only occasionally now, slowly being reclaimed by the vegetation and the albatrosses that make Midway their home in greater numbers than any human garrison ever did. The wrecks of the ships that sank in 1942 lie on the seafloor, slowly dissolving into the ocean chemistry that made them home. Now to the coral and the fish that care nothing about the strategic calculations that sent those ships here. The war has become archaeology. Iwo Jima is administered by Japan, returned to Japanese sovereignty in 1968. The sulphurous smell that gives the island its name, Iwo Jima means Sulphur Island, still rises from the volcanic fumaroles in the black sand. Mount Suribachi, where the flag was raised in the photograph that defined an era of American military mythology, is still there, the same cone of dark volcanic rock, looking out over the same expanse of ocean. The Japanese government maintains a small military detachment on the island, and there are periodic ceremonies to honour both Japanese and American dead, ceremonies that have, over the decades, taken on a quality of mutual respect and shared mourning that would have seemed impossible in 1945, and that speaks to something true about the human capacity to eventually move beyond even the most terrible violence, given sufficient time and sufficient willingness. The Falklands are still British, still cold, still windy, still inhabited by people who want to be British, and by enormous numbers of penguins who want to be on a beach. The War of 1982 is a living memory for the older residents, people who remember hiding in their houses while the fighting moved across the hills above Stanley, who remember the Argentine occupation and the liberation, who remember the particular experience of being at the centre of an international crisis while living in a community small enough that everyone knew everyone else, and the person who had just been killed in the hills above town was someone's neighbour, someone's father. The war has become history in the sense that there are now people living on the islands who were born after it, who know it as something that happened before rather than something they experienced. But it has not yet become the kind of distant history that can be viewed with complete detachment. It is still close enough to be felt. And in the South China Sea, on the artificial islands that China has built on submerged reefs, soldiers and sailors and Air Force personnel are maintaining their stations through the heat of tropical summers and the occasional typhoon that sweeps through the archipelago with devastating force. The bases are functional, the runways are operational, the radar dishes are turning and the sensors are recording. History is not finished here. The pattern that began in the Banda Sea in 1511, when Portuguese sailors first smelled nutmeg on the tropical air and understood that they had found something worth fighting for, has arrived at this moment and this place, and it is still unresolved. The South China Sea is where the logic of island empire is being written in the 21st century, and the writing is not yet complete. The islands themselves say nothing about any of this. They are not strategic assets, and they are not chess pieces, and they are not symbols of national pride or imperial reach, even though human beings have made them all of these things, sometimes simultaneously. They are places, specific, particular, irreplaceable places, with their own ecologies, their own climates, their own relationships to the sea and the sky, and the life that grows on them and in the water around them. The nutmeg tree does not know it started a war. The coral atoll does not know it was the site of the battle that determined who would control the Pacific Ocean for the second half of the 20th century. The limestone of Valletta does not know it was quarried and carved and mortared into walls by men who knew they might be defending those walls to the death within their lifetimes, and who built them anyway with every refinement of military engineering that their era knew. What the islands know, if they know anything at all in the way that places accumulate the experience of everything that has happened on them and around them, is the water that surrounds them, its temperature and its chemistry and its movement, the daily rhythm of tides, and the longer rhythms of season and current that structure the island's relationship to the ocean it inhabits. They know the sky above them, the particular quality of light at different hours in their particular latitudes, the stars that appear over them at night in configurations that have not changed since before any human being ever looked at them. They know the life that has always lived on them and around them, the birds that nest in their cliffs, the fish that school in the reefs offshore, the insects and plants and small mammals that have evolved, in some cases, to live only on that one island and nowhere else on Earth. This is the real life of islands, older than empire, continuing after empire, indifferent to empire in the way that the natural world is always indifferent to the political arrangements of the species that imagines it is in charge. The islands have existed longer than the empires that fought over them. Most of them will exist longer than the nations that currently claim them. The sea will outlast every flag and every treaty and every cannon and every aircraft carrier and every artificial island built on a submerged reef. And in the very long run of geological time, the kind of time that volcanoes and coral reefs and tectonic plates deal in, even the islands themselves are temporary, rising from the ocean and subsiding back into it on timescales that make the 500 years of the Age of Empire look like a brief and very intense afternoon. But that is not the timescale on which human beings live and love and fight and make history. On the timescale of human lives, of the Portuguese sailor who smelled nutmeg on the tropical air in 1511 and understood what he was looking at, of the Bandanese woman who watched Dutch soldiers come through her village in 1621, of the knight who climbed the walls of Valletta, in the August heat of 1565, of the enslaved person who stood at the edge of a burning sugar plantation in Saint-Domingue on the night of August 21st, 1791, of the American dive bomber pilot who found the Japanese carriers at Midway on the morning of June 4, 1942, of the Falkland Islander who looked out her window in April 1982 and saw Argentine soldiers in the streets of Stanley. On that timescale, the islands mattered enormously, and the decisions made about them changed everything. And now, as this long story draws to its close, let the images find their resting places in your mind. The nutmeg groves of Banda, fragrant in the tropical dark. The honey-coloured walls of Valletta, their stones warm even in the night air. The black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima, cold and strange under the Pacific stars. The carved wooden doors of Stone Town in Zanzibar, their elaborate patterns made by craftsmen whose names are lost but whose work endures. The penguins of the Falklands, patient and warm in their colonies on the cold shore, indifferent to the dramas that have played out on the hillsides behind them. The albatrosses of Midway turning on the wind above the quiet water in great slow circles, their wings barely moving, their navigation unerring and ancient and entirely their own. These places have held the world's history in their geography, and the history has moved through them like water through stone. Slowly, inexorably, leaving its marks in the rock but not diminishing the rock itself. The islands endure. And knowing their stories, understanding why the world has always found them worth fighting for, you carry something with you into the night's remaining hours. The knowledge that the smallest places have always held the largest secrets, that the ocean which appears to separate them from the world has always been the thing that connected them to everything, and that wherever there is a strategic waterway and a piece of land that commands it, human beings will find reasons to build their forts and plant their flags and fight their wars, generation after generation, until the sea finally rises to take it all back. Sleep now. The ocean is wide and dark and full of islands, each one specific and particular and irreplaceable, each one sitting in its ancient position under the stars that have witnessed everything. They are still there, where they have always been, patient and quiet in the dark. The water moves around them in its tidal rhythms, the birds settle into their nighttime stillness. And somewhere, on a small island in a large ocean that most people will never visit and few will ever think about, a nutmeg tree opens its pale fruit in the warm tropical night air, and the fragrance rises, drifts across the water, and disappears into the dark, the way all things eventually do, the way even empires do, leaving behind only the island and the sea, and the long, soft sound of the waves.